In 196 BC, Rome stood in a Greek stadium and announced freedom, like it was a gift. But freedom was never free. It was a bill, paid in garrisons, hostages, tribute, and the quiet surrender of decision-making. Not gold, not marble. The real currency was obedience, recorded not in poetry, but in treaties. So here's the question that will govern everything you're about to see. How did Rome turn liberation into a technology of control? So clean, it looked like law, so moral, it sounded like mercy, and so total, it rewired the will of entire cities. Chronicles celebrate victories. But the ground, fortresses, ports, and the three chains of Greece tells you what victory really means. Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The 2nd century BC is often sold as Rome's heroic age, after Carthage, before civil war, when the Republic still wore its virtue like armor. But virtue is easy when you're winning. The Mediterranean had barely stopped smoking from the Second Punic War. Rome had survived Hannibal, yes, but survival does not produce mercy. It produces paranoia. Every city that once betrayed Rome, every ally that hesitated, every tribe that smelled weakness, they all became problems to be managed. And Rome's genius was that it didn't always manage problems with conquest. Sometimes it managed them with definitions. Ally, free city, friend of the Roman people. These are not compliments, they are categories. They decide who pays, who obeys, who gets garrisoned, who gets protected. In the West, Carthage was forced into a peace that felt like a collar. In the East, a different animal watched from beyond the Aegean. The Seleucid Empire, huge, ancient, and restless. Its king was Antiochus III, a man later called the Great while he still lived. He had marched from Anatolia to the Iranian plateau, pressed into the Far East, and returned with the confidence of a ruler who believed the world could be reassembled. He wasn't a barbarian warlord, he was a bureaucrat of ambition, a king who understood that empire is logistics, marriages, and oaths as much as it is spears. While Rome was bandaging Italy, Antiochus was tightening his grip on Asia Minor, peering toward Thrace, and watching Egypt weaken under child kings and bad regents. He didn't need to love war. He only needed to love leverage. And between Rome and Antiochus lay Greece, fractured, proud, and dangerously exploitable. City-states shouted about autonomy while secretly begging outsiders to guarantee it. Leagues formed, leagues split, and each faction learned the same dirty trick. Invite a giant to crush a neighbor, then call it freedom. This is the moral rot at the center of our story. Greece was not just a victim. It was also an accomplice. Because when two superpowers stare each other down, the smaller states don't pray for peace. They auction themselves. And the highest bidder doesn't always pay with coins. Sometimes he pays with promises. Promises backed by legions, fleets, and the legal right to decide what freedom means. By the time Antiochus sent friendly words west, Rome's Senate heard something else underneath. Hannibal's shadow, whispers of invasion, and the oldest imperial fear, another power that refuses to know its place. The stage is set, the ledger is open, and the first entries will be written in Greek blood, signed in Latin ink. Rome didn't emerge from the Second Punic War as a calm victor. It emerged like an animal that had survived a knife fight, alive, stronger, and incapable of trusting anyone again. The war ended in 201 BC, but the Republic's nervous system stayed in wartime mode. Italy was scarred. The treasury had been drained and refilled through emergency levies and opportunistic seizures. Veterans came home trained to kill, not to plough. And across the Mediterranean, everyone had a memory of what Rome looked like when it was desperate, ruthless, improvisational, and willing to burn entire regions to prove a point. This is the first thing the glossy versions of Roman expansion hide from you. Rome's power grew out of insecurity. It built control systems the way a traumatized person builds habits, because the alternative feels like death. To the east, Antiochus III ran a different kind of machine. The Seleucid Empire was not a citizen republic pretending to hate kings. It was a royal state pretending to be the heir of Alexander. Antiochus inherited a realm with cracks everywhere: rebellious satrapies, ambitious neighbours, Greek cities on the coast that loved autonomy until the bill arrived, and the constant pressure of Ptolemaic Egypt to the south. His response was not moral, it was structural. He spent years stitching the empire back together. Campaigns, yes, but also treaties, appointments, and the careful performance of legitimate rule. The script you read calls him brilliant, cunning, a geopolitical mastermind. That's not just flattery. Antiochus understood something most rulers learn too late. An empire is not land. It's compliance, renewed every season like a tax contract. The moment your subjects stop believing you can punish them, they stop obeying you. The moment your allies suspect you can't protect them, they stop paying you. And so, Antiochus did what strong rulers do when they sense weakness nearby. He moved. He clashed with Egypt before, and in 217 BC at Raphia, he was turned back in spectacular fashion. Thousands of men, war elephants, the full Hellenistic theatre of violence, and still he lost. But defeat didn't teach him humility. It taught him timing. He didn't need to win every battle. He needed to win the next one. That chance came when Ptolemy IV died in 204 BC, and Egypt fell into the hands of regents guarding a child king, Ptolemy V. The borders became a buffet. Revolts flared. Court politics rotted the command structure. And here's the cold economic truth. A weak Egypt meant a disrupted grain system, unstable tax flows, and a wobbling balance of power across the eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus could have tried to crush Egypt outright, but full conquest is expensive. Soldiers must be fed, ports secured, garrisons paid, rebellions suppressed. So, he chose the cheaper weapon, diplomacy with teeth, a marriage. Cleopatra I, his daughter, married into the Ptolemaic line. In one stroke, a hostile rival was rebranded as family, less an enemy than a managed dependency. Now look back west. Rome's hands were not as free as they pretended. The Senate was juggling uprisings in Spain, tensions in Gaul, quarrels in Sicily, and the long aftertaste of Italian cities that had once sided with Hannibal. Even Macedon, newly defeated, was a problem wearing a mask. The peace terms after the Second Macedonian War, ended in 197 BC, were designed to humble Philip V and prevent him from rebuilding a threat. Greece heard freedom proclaimed in 196 BC, but Rome's real message was practical. No one in the region would raise an army large enough to surprise Italy again. Freedom, yes, so long as it stayed weak. This is where the 70-30 truth lives. 70% of this story is geopolitics. 30% is psychology and philosophy. But that 30% is the engine. Rome and Antiochus did not drift into war because they loved blood. They drifted because their systems required dominance to feel safe. Rome needed predictable borders and obedient allies because its political class depended on prestige and stability. Senators won careers through military success. Generals returned with loot and legitimacy. Provinces became revenue streams. The Republic's internal economy, political and financial, rewarded expansion even when expansion was sold as defense. Antiochus, on the other hand, needed to project the image of an unstoppable royal center because his empire was a mosaic of elites who would defect the moment he looked fragile. So, in the early 190s, both giants performed restraint. Antiochus sent an embassy to Rome around 195 BC, speaking of friendship. Rome, still bleeding, didn't want another grand war across the sea. On paper, the boundaries were clear. Rome would dominate the West and its liberated Greek sphere. Antiochus would dominate Asia. But paper is not reality. Reality is a corridor of ports, islands, and mountain passes called Greece. An irregular fault line where every smaller state could weaponize the rivalry. And that's the real danger zone. The space between empires where freedom becomes a bargaining chip. Greek leagues, Anatolian cities, and exiled politicians learned to play the giants against each other. They didn't have to defeat Rome or Antiochus. They only had to provoke, to create enough friction that one superpower would step in to stabilize. And stabilization always comes with conditions. So when Rome and Antiochus looked at Greece, they weren't seeing philosophy. They were seeing logistics. Harbors that could host fleets, passes that could channel armies, and cities that could be turned into chains. Corinth, Chalcis, Demetrius, locking the peninsula like a prison gate. Whoever controlled those points didn't just control Greece, they controlled the flow of war itself. The stage, then, is not a battlefield yet. It's a contract table. Two giants, each pretending to respect the other, each quietly preparing the paperwork of domination. And in the shadows, a single name, Hannibal, moves like a spark through dry grass. Because the moment Rome believes Hannibal has found shelter under Antiochus, restraint will stop being a virtue. It will become a weakness. And Rome never forgives weakness. Carthage didn't expel Hannibal because Rome demanded it. That's the uglier truth. Carthage expelled him because peace has its own politics. And in peacetime, yesterday's savior becomes today's problem. After 201 BC, Carthage was alive, but humiliated. It was forced to pay, to obey, to swallow its pride in public and practice survival in private. The city's merchant class wanted predictable trade routes, not heroic speeches. The elites wanted Rome's tolerance more than they wanted Hannibal's glory. And Hannibal, trained by war, shaped by catastrophe, couldn't stop thinking like a general. He tried to pivot into politics, to reform, to tighten finances, to clean up the rot that had helped lose the war. But a man who tries to fix a defeated state makes enemies fast. Every reform creates a loser. Every loser looks for a patron. And in the post-war Mediterranean, the easiest patron to find was Rome. So, Hannibal was pushed out by his own city's fear. Fear of instability. Fear of provoking Rome. Fear that a famous man attracts consequences like lightning attracts metal. Exile was safer for Carthage than keeping him. For Hannibal, exile was a sentence without walls. He carried the one thing Rome could never forgive: proof that Rome could be made to bleed. Now, watch what happens when a symbol moves across a paranoid world. Hannibal didn't just leave Carthage. He detonated rumor. Every port, every council chamber, every petty king and Greek magistrate had the same calculation. If I can be the one to hand Hannibal to Rome, I gain favor. If I shelter him, I invite destruction. In a region stuffed with independent states that survived by leaning on someone stronger, Hannibal became radioactive. Nobody wanted him, except the one court that could afford to ignore Roman anger: Antiochus III. This is where the story turns from geopolitics into political psychology. Because Hannibal wasn't an army, he was a feeling. To Rome, his very existence was a reopened wound. Hannibal alive meant Rome's victory was incomplete. It meant a second shock could happen. It meant that even in peacetime, the Republic still had an enemy with a name. And empires hate named enemies. Named enemies make the public nervous. They make senators cautious. They make generals ambitious. They distort judgment. So when word spread that Hannibal was heading east, toward the Seleucid king, Rome's imagination sprinted ahead of the facts. Was it coincidence? Or a signal? Was Antiochus collecting Rome's greatest nightmare like a trophy? Would Hannibal become the brain behind a new invasion? Would the Aegean become a bridge for revenge? Notice the mechanism. Fear doesn't need evidence. Fear only needs plausibility. And Hannibal in Antiochus's orbit was plausible enough to poison diplomacy before a single treaty was even discussed. At almost the exact same time, Seleucid envoys moved west. They weren't marching with spears, they were walking with words. They came, in the script's telling, to establish friendly relations, an olive branch. But an olive branch looks different depending on who's holding it. In Rome, the Senate saw the branch and imagined the hand behind it. If Hannibal was now advising Antiochus, then every polite sentence could be read as a smoke screen. Every request for alliance could be read as reconnaissance. Every mention of friendship could be heard as a threat with a smile. This is how wars are manufactured without anyone consciously choosing them. The diplomatic ritual becomes a stage where both sides act out their worst assumptions. Rome had its reasons to be tense. It was withdrawing troops from Greece after the Macedonian War, trying to reduce costs and avoid overextension, while still preserving influence. Antiochus, meanwhile, was pressing claims in Thrace, European soil close to the Greek world Rome now treated as its moral showcase. On the map, these moves were not automatically hostile. In the mind, they were. And the mind is where the first battles of empires are fought. Because Rome's power wasn't just legions, it was categories. Friend, ally, free city, enemy. Once the Senate decided which label to apply, policy hardened. The label justified the action. It turned aggression into prevention, coercion into protection, occupation into liberation. This is the philosophical core we're circling. When law becomes a language of moral certainty, it can make violence feel like administration. Hannibal's presence threatened to flip a label. It threatened to turn Antiochus from potential partner into future enemy. And once that switch happens, even good faith diplomacy becomes impossible, because every concession looks like weakness, and every refusal looks like guilt. Meanwhile, The smaller states watched this panic like gamblers watching the dice. Greek leagues and Anatolian cities understood something the giants refused to admit. A cold war between empires is a marketplace. You can sell loyalty, you can sell outrage, you can sell freedom as a pretext. The louder the superpowers distrust each other, the higher your bargaining power becomes. In that environment, peace is not a virtue. Peace is a missed opportunity. So Hannibal arrives in the east, and in the west, Rome's Senate starts hearing footsteps that aren't there yet. And now the trap closes. Because the next time Seleucid envoys step into the Senate, they will not be heard as messengers. They will be heard as an audition for war. Rome will ask for boundaries. It has no legal right to demand. Antiochus will hear those demands as an insult to kingship itself. And the Greek world, sitting between them like dry timber, will learn what happens when you build your freedom on other people's fear. The Senate chamber in Rome was not a place where truth was discovered. It was a place where reality was declared. Words there didn't describe the world, they assigned it categories. And once a category was assigned, it became policy, and policy became fate. So when the Seleucid embassy arrived, men sent in the language of ritual friendship. Rome did what rising powers always do when they sense a rival. It rewrote the terms of conversation while pretending the rewrite was normal. Livy preserves the shape of the moment. The envoys, led by Menippus and Hegesianax, came forward as if this were a standard diplomatic exchange. Their message was simple: establish friendly relations, form an alliance. Not surrender. Not a peace imposed on the defeated. Friendship between equals. At least, that's what they were instructed to ask for. And here's where the legal theatre begins. Menippus essentially argues that there are three kinds of treaties. One between victor and vanquished. One between evenly matched enemies. And one between states that have never been enemies, who unite in a league of friendship. In that third category, he says, there should be no imposed conditions, because conditions belong to conquest. Conditions are what you force on someone you've beaten. If Rome demands conditions from Antiochus, then Rome is admitting something it doesn't want to say out loud, that it already treats Antiochus like a defeated party, before the war even starts. This is not just rhetoric, it's a warning flare. Menippus is basically saying, if you try to manage us like you managed Philip of Macedon, you are writing the first line of a war. But the Senate was not interested in categories that protected the dignity of kings. The Senate was interested in categories that protected Italy. The senators, already inflamed by rumors of Hannibal and terrified by the idea of a rival superpower building influence in Greece, heard the embassy's polite words and translated them into a threat. They want a foothold. They want Greece. They want a bridge to us. In an atmosphere like that, diplomacy becomes an interrogation. Every sentence is treated as a disguise. So Rome countered with a demand that sounds administrative, almost reasonable, until you see what it really is. They demanded a partition, a firm line between what belonged to Roman influence and what belonged to Seleucid influence. In plain terms, Europe is ours. Asia is yours. Stay on your side. This is the Republic's moral magic trick. It doesn't say, we are conquering. It says, we are organizing. It doesn't say, obey us. It says, respect the boundaries. It turns domination into a geography lesson. But Antiochus was already campaigning in Thrace. European ground, pressing what he called ancestral claims. Thrace wasn't a minor detail. Thrace was the point. Because if the Senate could force Antiochus out of Thrace by diplomatic ultimatum, it would prove something enormous: that Rome could dictate where a Hellenistic king could legally stand without firing a spear. That would be power beyond conquest. That would be power as definition. And the Senate pushed harder. A senator, Galba, in the script's telling, cuts through the niceties and lays down something closer to an ultimatum: cede Thrace or else. Not a request, not negotiation, a threat wrapped in senatorial dignity. Now look at what just happened structurally. The Seleucid envoys came seeking a treaty of friendship, the type without conditions. Rome responds by offering the treaty type reserved for victors, without having won anything yet. Rome is attempting to harvest the psychological fruits of victory before paying the physical costs of war. This is the political philosophy Rome exports. If you can make your rival accept your vocabulary, you don't need to fight him. You just need to administer him. Menippus can't accept. He wasn't sent with authority to sign away royal claims, and even if he had been, accepting would have humiliated the king and weakened him at home. A Hellenistic monarch survives on prestige. A king who publicly yields to a foreign senate invites rebellion. Rome knows this. Rome is testing him. So the embassy leaves, empty-handed, carrying not a treaty but an insult. And insult is a kind of currency too, especially among rulers who are surrounded by men eager to prove their courage. Antiochus reacts defensively. He pulls back from Thrace into Anatolia, partly to avoid immediate escalation, partly to consolidate. And he tightens the Egyptian connection, finalizing the marriage that turns a rival into family. This is not the behavior of a man rushing to war. It is the behavior of a man realizing that Rome is trying to turn his diplomacy into a leash. Rome, following ritual, sends its own embassy, high-status men, former consuls, the kind of delegation that says, "This is not a misunderstanding. This is Rome speaking with its full weight." But here's the poison. One of them is reportedly the same Galba associated with the ultimatum. That's not just bad optics. That's psychological pressure. It signals that Rome is not interested in softening its stance. It is interested in forcing a precedent. And while both great powers insist they want peace, the smaller states between them are already reading the situation like a market. If Rome can be made to fear, Rome will pay in protection. If Antiochus can be made to feel insulted, Antiochus will pay in intervention. Greece and Anatolia don't need to choose a side for moral reasons. They can choose a side for profit. So the stage shifts. The war is not declared, but the logic of war is now embedded in law and pride. Rome has tried to redraw the map by decree. Antiochus has discovered that friendship in Roman language can still come with a bill. Peace was not collapsing because Rome and Antiochus woke up one morning craving blood. Peace was collapsing because the states trapped between them discovered a lucrative truth. When two giants hesitate, the small can sell the hesitation. In Anatolia, Greek cities along the coast spoke the language of autonomy like prayer. In practice, autonomy was a lease agreement. A free city was free the way a shop is free to operate, until the landlord shows up with a new rent. Their survival depended on external guarantors. Whoever could deter the next raid, the next seizure, the next royal tax collector. Rome, to them, wasn't a moral beacon. Rome was leverage. If you could be seen as friends of the Roman people, you didn't necessarily gain protection. You gained bargaining power against Seleucid officials. You could negotiate lighter tribute, fewer garrisons, more local control, and you could threaten to complain to a distant Senate that loved playing judge. Rome encouraged this because it was cheaper than conquest. This is the economic mechanism under the speeches. A garrison costs grain, pay, ships, and attention. But if a city polices itself while calling you its liberator, you get influence without payroll. You get a foothold without the bill. And in mainland Greece, the game was nastier because the players were closer, louder, and more addicted to factional drama. The Greek world in this period was a mosaic of leagues and resentments. Achaean League, Aetolian League, old Spartan pride, Macedonian shadows, and city-states that could switch loyalties as easily as they switched magistrates. Every coalition was temporary, every treaty contained tomorrow's betrayal. Everyone preached freedom, and everyone begged for an outside sponsor when freedom became inconvenient. Rome's withdrawal of troops from Greece after the Macedonian War should have been a relief. It was interpreted as an opening. The moment the legions started marching back, every Greek faction did the same calculus. How far can we push before Rome returns? And can we make Rome return for us? This is where freedom turns grotesque. It becomes a bait you dangle in front of a superpower's ego. Sparta was the first test case because Sparta had become a symbol again, an old brand with a new strong man. During the war with Macedon, Sparta had maneuvered opportunistically, playing sides, grabbing what it could, Argos being the strategic prize in the script's telling. The Achaean League complained to Rome. Rome sided with Achaea. On paper, this was justice against duplicity. In reality, it was Rome deciding which Greek faction would be allowed to be strong, and which faction would be punished as an example. And the punishment came with choreography. Roman and allied forces did not just defeat Sparta. They demonstrated a system. They probed garrisons, bypassed obstacles, struck at the port, Gythium, because ports are where cities breathe. Cut the port and you cut the supply line. Control the harbour and you control the politics. Siege is not only a military operation, it's an economic strangulation. Grain doesn't arrive, pay doesn't arrive, morale doesn't arrive. When Nabis surrendered, Sparta was stripped and reduced. That reduction is the point. Rome wasn't trying to annihilate Sparta. Annihilation creates martyrs and empty land no one can tax. Rome wanted a living, humbled Sparta, an object lesson with a flag still standing, subordination packaged as stability. Now the Aetolians watched this and drew the obvious conclusion. Ally is starting to mean subject, and that implication, whether Rome intended it or not, was poisonous. The Aetolian League had been useful to Rome against Macedon. Useful allies are dangerous because they remember they were once needed. After victory, Rome did what victors always do. It stopped paying attention to the feelings of the tools it had used. The Aetolians wanted harsher terms on Macedon. Rome didn't. Rome wanted Macedon weak, but intact. A broken Macedon creates a vacuum that somebody else, maybe Antiochus, could fill. So Rome chose containment over revenge. To Aetolia, this felt like betrayal and insult. And insult is where the Greek political economy runs best. Aetolia couldn't beat Rome directly. So it did what small powers do when faced with a superior force. It tried to change the game board. It started sending emissaries to Antiochus, complaining about Roman overreach, requesting arbitration, hinting that Rome was not fit to manage Greece. That hint is not a diplomatic gesture. It's a provocation designed to corner Rome. If Rome responds violently, Aetolia can cry tyranny and rally Greek sympathy. If Rome responds softly, Aetolia gains space to keep undermining it. Rome tried the diplomatic route, insisting that as an ally, Aetolia should bring grievances to the Senate first. Even if Rome meant this as procedure, the implication was clear: permission. And for Greeks who treated autonomy like religion, the idea that alliance meant filing complaints with Rome like a subordinate was intolerable. So Aetolia redirected its anger onto a weaker target: Sparta, recently crushed, exposed, and desperate. Sparta appealed to Rome for help, which is the final irony. The victim of Roman liberation now begged Roman authority to save it from other Greeks. This is complicity made visible. Rome doesn't need to conquer when its free states request supervision. Aetolia's move against Sparta didn't produce the swift victory it hoped for, and it withdrew before Rome could intervene decisively. But that failure didn't end the scheme. It escalated it. Because if you can't win by force, you win by instability. The smaller states had learned the principle that will drag Antiochus and Rome into collision. Create chaos, then sell yourself as the solution. Make Greece ungovernable, then invite a king across the sea as liberator. Force Rome to choose between abandoning its moral narrative or enforcing it with violence. Either choice weakens Rome's image. Either choice makes enemies. So by the time Antiochus resumes activity in Thrace, and Aetolia starts plotting against the so-called fetters of Greece, those strategic cities that lock the peninsula, the conflict is no longer about borders. It's about who gets to define what freedom means, and who gets to invoice the pain required to enforce that definition. Sparta didn't fall in one glorious clash of spears. It fell the modern way, through paperwork, alliances, and a war sold as stability. By the mid-1990s BC, Rome had already learned the most profitable trick an expanding power can learn. You don't need to annex a place to own it. You only need to decide who may fight, how many ships they may build, and which cities count as free. In Greece, Rome wore the mask of a liberator, but its hands were busy tying knots. Sparta became the demonstration model. During the war with Macedon, Sparta, under its strongman king Nabis, played a dirty survivalist game. It leaned whichever direction gave it leverage, and in the confusion, it seized Argos, a prize that mattered not because of its poetry, but because of its position. Control. Argos. And you're not just holding a city. You're holding a choke point in the Peloponnese's politics. The Achaean League complained. Rome listened. Not because Rome loved Achaea, because Rome loved the principle that no Greek power should grow too bold without Roman permission. So the Laconian War wasn't just about punishing Sparta, it was about setting precedent. Rome chooses which Greek disputes become international issues. That is how freedom gets its price tag. You can be autonomous, but only inside boundaries defined by a foreign senate. The campaign itself reveals Rome's method. It didn't have to hurl legions against every wall to win. It could coordinate a coalition, apply pressure on multiple fronts, and let Greek allies do much of the exhausting work. Because in a system of indirect control, the best violence is outsourced violence. Your allies bleed, you arbitrate. Your allies burn, you negotiate. You appear as judge while benefiting like a conqueror. The assault moved like a lesson in logistics. Argos was a problem, yes, but not the problem. The port was the problem. Gythium, Sparta's fortified harbour, was where supplies entered, where ships sheltered, where the city connected to the wider world. And in ancient war, the wide world is the difference between siege and starvation. So the coalition converged by land and sea, squeezing the coastline, raiding the surrounding lands, pulling at the threads that kept Sparta fed and confident. This is the economic side of conquest that heroic narratives skip. War is a famine engine. Burn the granaries, seize the herds, disrupt the market days, and you don't just weaken an army, you fracture a city's social order. The poor panic first. Prices spike. Loyalists get blamed. Factions sharpen knives. The battlefield is not only outside the walls, it's inside the head of every citizen, calculating whether resistance is worth the hunger. Sparta resisted behind newly built walls, and the script paints it in harsh street-level terms. Days of holding out, then a breach, then Romans and allies forcing their way into the city. In that moment, the old myth of Sparta, the disciplined warrior state, collides with the reality of siege warfare. Chaos. Buildings set on fire, defenders buying minutes with smoke, streets becoming corridors of terror where you can't tell whether the footsteps behind you are yours or the enemy's. This is where the moral cost of order shows itself. Rome's narrative is clean. Restore freedom, punish duplicity, stabilize Greece. The human experience is not clean. The human experience is a city burning its own homes to slow an advance. It is civilians trapped between a garrison's desperation and an invader's momentum. It is the blunt truth that liberation often arrives wearing a boot. Then Nabis surrendered. And this is the part that looks merciful on the surface and feels like a leash underneath. Sparta was not erased. It was reduced. Stripped of territory, stripped of power, compelled into a subservient relationship, absorbed into the Achaean League's orbit, which itself existed under Rome's shadow. Rome didn't need to annex Laconia to control it. It only needed to make Sparta dependent, watched, and unable to act alone. That's the psychological genius of Rome's system in Greece. It trains states to beg for the very oversight that humiliates them. Sparta, once the symbol of autonomy, now had to appeal to Rome as overlord for help against other Greeks. Think about what that does to a region's political instincts. Every dispute becomes an opportunity to invite Rome back in. Every threat becomes a reason to accept temporary supervision. And temporary supervision is the oldest lie in empire. The garrison that arrives for now leaves behind a habit of obedience that outlasts the soldiers. To Rome, this arrangement solved multiple problems at once. It neutralized Sparta as an independent military actor. It rewarded loyal allies like Achaea. It signaled to Macedon that Rome could still reach into Greek affairs at will. And it preserved the Republic's self-image, Rome as referee, not tyrant. But referees who can bring legions aren't referees. They are owners of the stadium. And other Greeks noticed, especially the Aetolians, proud, volatile, and furious that alliance was starting to sound like subordination. They watched Sparta's humiliation and learned the lesson. that would push the entire peninsula toward disaster. If Rome can do this to Sparta in the name of freedom, then freedom is just a word Rome rents out to whoever benefits it most. So peace after Sparta wasn't peace. It was a rearrangement of resentments. Aetolia's anger sharpened. Macedon's humiliation festered. The free cities of Greece learned they were free only until the next complaint reached the Senate. And somewhere across the sea, Antiochus III watched a new kind of power at work. Power that didn't conquer with crowns, but with categories. Aetolia didn't want a debate. It wanted a crisis. After Sparta, the mask slipped. Rome could still call itself liberator, but everyone with eyes could see the mechanism underneath. A league is useful until it becomes inconvenient. An ally is honored until it asks for payment. A free city is free until it disobeys. The Aetolian League had fought alongside Rome against Macedon, and that history created the most dangerous emotion in politics: entitlement. They believed victory had earned them influence. Rome believed victory had earned it authority. Those are not compatible beliefs. They cannot coexist in the same room without someone bleeding. Aetolia's grievance had a simple shape. Rome had been too gentle with Philip V of Macedon after 197 BC. Aetolia wanted harsher terms, more humiliation, more extraction. Because in Greek politics, punishing a rival is often mistaken for justice. Rome refused, not because Rome was kind, but because Rome was calculating. A broken Macedon would create a vacuum. Vacuums invite opportunists, and Rome had already seen what an opportunist looks like. His name was Hannibal. So, Rome chose containment, and Aetolia heard betrayal. The insult wasn't only strategic, it was psychological. Aetolia had helped win a war, and now it was being told to sit quietly while Rome managed the settlement. That's the moment an ally starts realizing it has become furniture. And when furniture becomes aware, it tries to move. Aetolia's first move was political theatre, emissaries to Antiochus III, talking about Roman overreach, requesting arbitration, hinting that Greece needed a protector who wasn't Rome. The message was not, "Come save us." The message was, "You can profit here." They weren't inviting a philosopher king, they were advertising a marketplace. Because what Aetolia understood, and what Rome tried to deny, was that freedom in Greece had become a commodity. Whoever could credibly threaten violence could sell protection. Whoever could credibly offer protection could demand concessions. And the smaller states, trapped between empires, were learning to flip allegiance into leverage, like a coin across a table. Rome tried to slam the table with procedure. Flamininus, the administrator of Greek affairs, reportedly insisted that as an ally, Aetolia should bring its objections to the Senate first. This sounds mild, bureaucratic even, but that's exactly why it enraged Aetolia. Bureaucracy is how domination wears gloves. The implication was clear. Your complaints are not political disagreements. They are documents to be filed with your superior. So Aetolia did what the weak do. When they can't punch upward, it punched sideways. It turned on Sparta again, recently shattered, desperate, and therefore perfect as a target. Sparta appealed to Rome for aid, and the irony is so sharp it should cut you. The city once synonymous with autonomy now begged Rome as an overlord. This is complicity as a survival strategy. Rome didn't need to enforce obedience by force if Greek states would police each other and then call Rome to arbitrate the mess. But Aetolia didn't get the clean win it wanted against Sparta, and it pulled back before Rome could respond decisively. That retreat was not weakness. It was escalation, because the point was never to conquer Sparta. The point was to make Greece ungovernable. Now comes the truly dangerous part. Aetolia's three-pronged plot against the fetters of Greece, the strategic cities whose control locked the peninsula. These weren't symbolic targets, they were logistical keys. Whoever held them could regulate movement, supply, and influence like valves on an artery. Demetrius controlled access in the north. Chalcis watched over the straits. Corinth sat like a gate between mainland and Peloponnese. Take these, and you don't just win battles, you write the terms of everyone else's choices. Aetolia's plan showed what desperation does to a political system. It turns ideology into sabotage. At Demetrius, they used an exiled politician to gain access, an insider's key. It worked. The city swung to Aetolia, and suddenly the map shifted. Not through open war, but through infiltration, betrayal, and the soft underbelly of Greek civic life. Faction. At Chalcis, the plot collapsed under its own cleverness. The man in charge insisted on an overcomplicated scheme, so complex it leaked. That's always the irony of conspirators. They want control so badly, they create a plan too fragile to survive human incompetence. Chalcis locked its gates, and Aetolia was left outside, exposed, frustrated, and now publicly revealed as what Rome would call it, treacherous. But the Sparta operation, this is where the story becomes outright grotesque. Aetolia had only just signed a peace treaty with Sparta, and then it attacked anyway. Treaties, in this world, were not sacred promises. They were tactical pauses. The Aetolians stormed the city, assassinated the king, looted the palace. For a moment, it looked like success. Quick, brutal, decisive. Then the city snapped back like a sprung trap. The Spartans rallied around the young son of the murdered king. They turned the shock into phorging, and slaughtered the Aetolians to the man. And here is the political cost Aetolia either didn't anticipate or didn't care about. The optics were catastrophic. Combined with the failure at Chalcis, Aetolia now looked less like a champion of Greek freedom, and more like a gang of opportunists stabbing whoever stood nearest. Rome's allies seized on that story. Propaganda doesn't need to be invented when your enemy behaves like a villain in public. See, Rome could say, this is why we must supervise Greece. This is what Greek freedom looks like without Roman order. Aetolia, by trying to resist Rome, handed Rome the perfect justification to tighten control. And yet, Aetolia considered it a relative success. Because their top goal was not territorial gain, it was instability. If Greece becomes unstable, Rome looks incompetent. If Rome looks incompetent, the moral narrative cracks. And once that narrative cracks, Antiochus can be invited in not as an invader, but as a liberator. Aetolia could claim any Roman move against them was an attack on Greek freedom itself. That is the trap. Force Rome to either tolerate rebellion and look weak, or crush it and look tyrannical. Either way, Rome pays. And Antiochus, he didn't have to sign a formal alliance to signal interest. Sometimes tacit approval is enough. As Aetolia played with matches, Antiochus resumed his activity in Thrace, European ground, close enough to Greece to feel like a shadow falling across the map. The powder keg was now primed. The smaller states had done what they always do best. They turned ideology into gasoline and called it politics. Empires don't rule the world by convincing everyone. They rule it by controlling where people can move, where food can flow, where armies can breathe. The Greeks had a word for the strategic cities that made this possible. Cities so well placed that whoever held them could lock the entire peninsula. Polybius later calls them the fetters, the chains of Greece, Corinth, Chalcis, Demetrius. Not because the stones were magical, because the geography was. This is where you stop thinking about war as heroic clashes and start thinking about it as a supply problem with a moral disguise. Corinth is the gate. It sits at the isthmus, the narrow neck connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland. If you control Corinth, you can choke movement between north and south like a hand on a throat. Armies march on roads. Roads pass through gates. Gates have owners. And owners get to decide which free league may mobilize, which city may import weapons, which ally may send reinforcements without being delayed, taxed, or blocked. Chalcis is the switch. It watches the Euripus Strait, a narrow waterway that matters because the Greeks are not living on one piece of land. They're living on a shoreline. Whoever controls Chalcis can watch and interfere with traffic between Boeotia, Euboea, and the routes that lead toward the Aegean. That isn't just naval strategy. That's commerce. That's the movement of grain, timber, pitch, iron, horses. The materials that make war possible are the same materials that make ordinary life possible. Control the strait, and you can make a city rich or hungry, without ever besieging its walls. Demetrius is the hook. Up in Thessaly, it sits near the Pagasetic Gulf, positioned to influence northern Greece and the approach routes that connect Macedonia and the Greek heartland. It is a staging area, a hinge point, the kind of place where an army can land, assemble, and threaten multiple directions at once. In practical terms, Demetrius is where a foreign power can insert itself into Greek affairs and then pretend it was invited by friends. Put the three together, and you don't just control Greece. You control the choices available to Greece. And when you control choices, you control politics. This is the part of Rome's dominance that looks boring until you realize it is the entire story. Rome didn't need to sit a legion in every city. It needed to ensure the key valves were held by reliable hands, either Roman hands or the hands of allies who depended on Rome. The Achaean League could hold Corinth. Macedon could be forced to accept limitations around certain points. Garrisons could be rotated. The Senate could claim it was protecting freedom, while the map itself became a cage. Now look at why Aetolia's sabotage matters. Aetolia doesn't have to defeat Rome. It only has to disrupt the locks. If Aetolia can pry open one chain, say, flip Demetrius through an insider, then suddenly the entire peninsula feels less secure. Troops move differently. Confidence collapses. Allies panic. And panic is the currency that buys intervention. This is the brutal economics of stability. Stability is expensive. Whoever sells stability gets to invoice it. Rome understood that. It also feared the alternative. Greece in chaos was not only a Greek problem, it was a Roman security nightmare. Chaos invites a foreign king across the sea. Chaos invites mercenaries. Chaos invites another Hannibal-type figure to find a foothold. The Senate's obsession with keeping Greece orderly is often presented as Roman benevolence. In reality, It's Roman trauma weaponized into policy. And Antiochus understood the same geography from the opposite direction. If he wanted influence in Greece, he didn't need to conquer every polis. He needed a landing point, a friendly league, and at least one lock to swing open. Aetolia offered him exactly that, an invitation wrapped in ideology with practical access points behind the rhetoric. But here's the poisonous twist. Antiochus's authority as a king depended on appearing like the liberator, not the opportunist. He couldn't arrive announcing, "I want your ports." He had to arrive saying, "I have come for your freedom." That's how kings justify war without admitting it's business. And that's why Aetolia's language is so effective. It gives Antiochus a moral costume to wear while he steps onto a logistical stage. Meanwhile, Rome's legal posture was already hardening. The Senate had demanded a partition of Europe and Asia. It had tried to tell Antiochus where he could stand. That demand wasn't enforceable by law, only by violence. Which means, once Rome makes the demand, it begins quietly preparing to back it up. Laws without enforcement are jokes. Rome does not like jokes, so each chain of Greece became more than a fortress. It became a referendum on Roman credibility. If Demetrius flips, Rome looks weak. If Rome responds violently, Rome looks tyrannical. If Rome hesitates, Greek allies reconsider their dependence. If Rome overreacts, it confirms Aetolia's story about Roman domination. This is how smaller states trap empires. They force you into choices that all cost you something. They turn your virtue into a liability. And the people living inside these cities, this is the human cost often erased. Because control of Corinth sounds like a line on a map, but it means taxes, requisitions, forced billeting, disrupted trade, fear of informants, councils arguing under threat, and the quiet knowledge that your freedom is being negotiated by men who can afford to lose you. The chains aren't only strategic, they're psychological. They teach communities that politics is no longer about persuasion. It's about which foreign power you can summon fastest when your neighbor threatens you. So, when Aetolia strikes at the fetters, successfully at Demetrius, clumsily at Chalcis, catastrophically at Sparta, it isn't random chaos. It is a deliberate attempt to make the locks rattle, to make Rome feel Greece slipping, to make Antiochus smell opportunity. And Antiochus does not need a grand army to begin. He needs a reason, a banner, a moral claim, a call from Greeks themselves. That call is coming. By 192 BC, Greece was no longer a collection of quarrels. It was an argument about sovereignty that had turned into a supply problem. Rome wanted order without annexation. Antiochus wanted influence without triggering Rome. Aetolia wanted chaos because chaos was the only leverage it could afford. And the Greek city-states, the ones that shouted loudest about freedom, were quietly doing what they always did when freedom became dangerous: shopping for a protector. This is the point where the moral language becomes a costume party. Aetolia sent the message Antiochus needed to hear. Greece is calling you. Rome is overreaching. The liberator is becoming a master. Come arbitrate. Come restore Hellenic freedom. The pitch was beautifully designed because it targeted the exact vulnerabilities of a Hellenistic king. Antiochus did not rule by ballots. He ruled by prestige. He ruled by the belief that he was the rightful heir of Alexander's world. To be invited by Greeks, the cultural heartland, the theatre of legitimacy, was not merely a strategic opportunity. It was a stage to perform kingship itself. And Antiochus, already testing limits in Thrace and Asia Minor, stepped onto that stage. The problem is that Antiochus came with the wrong kind of certainty. He crossed into Greece with a force that was not overwhelming. It was symbolic. Enough to make a statement, not enough to crush resistance without help. That tells you what he believed, that the Greek world would rise in his favor, that Rome would hesitate, that his presence would trigger a cascade of defections the way Alexander's legacy sometimes did in the imagination of later kings. This is where power becomes self-deception. Monarchs surrounded by courtiers can start mistaking applause for consent. The Aetolians promised him a Greece ready to revolt. In reality, Greece was ready to bargain. Most Greek states did not see Antiochus as a savior. They saw him as a variable. The Achaean League had already tied itself to Rome's system. Rhodes and Pergamon had their own interests and feared a revived Seleucid dominance. Macedon, still bruised, watched for advantage, but didn't want to become the first target again. And the smaller poleis were not ideologues. They were survivors. They asked the only question that matters when an army lands: who will win, and what will the winner charge us afterward? This is the psychological trap Aetolia set for Antiochus. It invited him into a country where freedom meant alignment, and alignment meant invoices. Rome's response was predictable because Rome's incentives were structural. It could not allow a rival superpower to plant a royal banner on Greek soil after having publicly declared Greek freedom under Roman protection. If Rome tolerated it, it would invalidate the Senate's entire posture in the Eastern Mediterranean. Allies would doubt Rome's guarantees. Enemies would test boundaries. The Republic's authority would be revealed as a performance. And Rome does not tolerate performances it can't control. So Rome framed the situation the only way it knew how. Not as a contest of empires, but as a defense of Greek liberty. Antiochus was not arriving as an invited arbitrator. He was arriving as an invader. Rome's diplomats would emphasize the language of rescue. We are defending the freedom we proclaimed. It's brilliant propaganda because it forces Greek states into a false choice. Either side with Rome and call yourself pro-freedom, or side with Antiochus and let Rome call you a collaborator. Meanwhile, Antiochus tried to build legitimacy fast. He sought alliances, offered guarantees, and leaned hard on the symbolism of liberating Greece from foreign dominance. But every promise he made had a price: a garrison for protection, a treaty for friendship, a pledge of troops for common defense. These are the mechanics of empire, always packaged as mutual benefit, always enforced by the threat that if you refuse, you're choosing the other side. You can almost see the logistical reality creeping behind the rhetoric. Antiochus needs winter quarters, supply lines, local support. He needs ports and passes. He needs the chains. Demetrius, Chalcis, Corinth. Because without controlling movement, his army becomes a stranded guest in a hostile house. And Rome understands this too. Rome doesn't have to fight everywhere. It has to deny Antiochus the ability to move and feed his force. War, again, is administration with sharper tools. Now add the Hannibal factor back into the mix. To Roman senators, Antiochus in Greece is not merely Antiochus. It is the possibility that Hannibal's mind, Rome's nightmare, has found a new platform. Even if Hannibal has no operational control, the fear is operational. Fear pushes decisions faster than reason. Fear convinces you that delay is deadly. Fear makes preemptive violence feel like self-defense. So the Republic mobilizes. And Greece, this is the final humiliation, discovers it has become the arena where two great powers will prove whose definition of freedom is legally binding. The cities that thought they were manipulating Rome and Antiochus realize the giants are now using them as evidence in a trial. Rome will argue, we are the guarantors. Antiochus will argue, we are the liberators. Aetolia will argue, we are the revolution. And ordinary Greeks will pay the court fees in burned fields and requisitioned grain. Antiochus has stepped into Greece. The invitation has been accepted. The costume has been worn. Now the question becomes brutally concrete. Can he hold his position long enough to make his liberation real? Before Rome turns the moral narrative into a military noose? Dramatic turn. Antiochus is in Greece, but his coalition is thin, his supplies are mortal, and Rome is coming, not as a conqueror in its own story, but as a protector, ready to make an example. Thermopylae is the kind of name that makes men forget mathematics. It's a narrow pass with a wide reputation, one of those places where geography and myth fuse into a weapon. The story everyone remembers is 480 BC. A small force, a heroic stand, a betrayal through a mountain path. It's carved into the imagination like a monument. So when Antiochus III positioned himself at Thermopylae in 191 BC, it wasn't only a defensive choice, it was a psychological move. He wasn't just guarding a route into central Greece. He was trying to borrow the authority of legend, trying to make the landscape itself testify on his behalf. That's the seduction of symbolic war. It makes you feel righteous, and righteousness feels like strength. But righteousness doesn't feed an army. By this point, Antiochus was already discovering the real shape of his problem. Greece wasn't rising for him the way Aetolia promised. It was hesitating, bargaining, watching. His coalition was thin. His supply lines were fragile. The longer he stayed, the more expensive his liberation became. Winter quarters had to be secured, grain procured, troops paid, allies reassured. Every day he remained on Greek soil. He was not proving freedom. He was accumulating obligations. Rome, meanwhile, came with the one advantage that crushes charismatic invasions: institutional momentum. A consul with an army doesn't need a moral miracle. He needs roots, allies, and time. Rome could mobilize because it had already turned the Greek world into a network of dependencies. Achaean support, local guides, political legitimacy. Rome's liberation narrative wasn't just propaganda, it was infrastructure. And now the myth of Thermopylae becomes the perfect lens for the governing question of this whole story. Rome's law is not gentle, it is efficient. It makes coercion look like public order. Antiochus chose Thermopylae because it narrows the front. You can block a larger force with fewer men. You can anchor your line against the mountains and the sea. You can tell your allies and your enemies and your own troops, here is where history repeats. Aetolian forces took positions in the surrounding heights, the high ground that always decides whether a pass is a fortress or a coffin. If you hold the heights, you can rain missiles onto the road. If you lose the heights, your wall becomes a funnel. Rome arrived not as a single battering ram, but as a system. the Roman consul Manius Acilius Glabrio advanced with confidence because he wasn't only fighting Antiochus, he was fighting Antiochus's logistics. He could afford to press. He could afford to take Gaullers. He could afford to wait for the moment. When Antiochus's allies started asking quietly whether the king was still worth the price. The battle played out like a cruel parody of the old Persian story. Antiochus expected the pass to do the work, but Rome didn't accept the pass as destiny. Rome treated it like a problem to be solved. While pressure was applied at the front, a Roman detachment moved through the mountains by a route that should have been guided by local knowledge and hard experience. The same kind of maneuver that once broke the Spartan stand now threatened to break Antiochus's position. Myth repeats, but not as glory, as technique. And in that moment, you see the difference between Antiochus's strategy and Rome's strategy. Antiochus is fighting to be seen as the liberator king. Rome is fighting to demonstrate that liberation is Rome's trademark, not his. Rome doesn't need Thermopylae's blessing. It needs Thermopylae's outcome. A clean victory, a forced retreat. A message to every wavering city. The Roman definition of freedom is the only definition that survives contact with legions. When the flanking threat became real, Antiochus's position at Thermopylae stopped being a symbol and became a trap. His line was vulnerable. Retreat routes were limited. Panic spreads faster in a narrow space because there's nowhere for fear to dissipate. A defensive stance that relies on morale collapses the moment morale realizes it has been outmaneuvered. Antiochus withdrew. The liberator ran, not because he was a coward, but because the physics of war didn't care about his story. He fled back toward the coast and escaped by sea, leaving Greece behind the way you abandon a burning house, not with dignity, but with survival. This is the horrifying part that polite histories sanitize. Retreat is not cinematic. Retreat is men dropping shields, officers shouting into wind, allies blaming each other, supplies left to be captured, wounded left to be collected by strangers. It is the sudden discovery that your grand ideological entry into Greece has become an expensive detour. For Rome, Thermopylae was not just a battle won, it was a psychological conversion operation. Every Greek state watching learned the same lesson. A king can promise freedom, but Rome can deliver consequences. After Thermopylae, neutrality looks less like prudence, and more like a gamble against a machine that rarely loses. And the machine now had momentum. Because once Rome forces Antiochus off Greek soil, the war can no longer be contained by Greek quarrels. The stage shifts across the Aegean. The question stops being, who will guard Greece, and becomes, who will be allowed to exist as a peer power in the eastern Mediterranean. Antiochus has lost Greece. Rome has won the narrative. Now Rome faces its next choice: end the war by intimidation, or follow Antiochus home and turn defense of freedom into a full-spectrum imperial settlement in Asia. After Thermopylae, the war stopped pretending to be about Greek freedom. Greece had been the stage. Now the argument moved to the owner's office. Antiochus escaped by sea and returned to Asia Minor, to the part of the world where his rule was not a performance but a machinery. Satraps, treasuries, fortified cities, royal roads. Rome, meanwhile, did what it always does when a boundary is tested. It turned a defensive narrative into an offensive solution. If Antiochus could be defeated in Greece and still remain a king with a fleet, a treasury, and allies, then the Senate had only postponed the problem. Postponement is not security. Postponement is a future war with higher interest. So Rome crossed the Aegean. This is the logistical heart of Roman expansion. The Republic learns to fight far from home by converting allies into infrastructure. Pergamon, Rhodes, and other regional powers had their own reasons to fear Seleucid dominance. They didn't love Rome out of principle. They preferred Rome's distant supervision to Antiochus's nearby taxation. Rome provided the moral banner. The allies provided knowledge, ports, and naval reach. Imperial coalition building looks noble from a distance. Up close, it's a supply chain. Antiochus also tried to solve the problem structurally. He attempted diplomacy. He tried to negotiate terms that would preserve dignity. Rome's terms were hard, because Rome's fear was hard. A king who has stepped into Greece once can step in again. A king who shelters Hannibal, Rome's nightmare, feels like an existential threat, even if he never utters Hannibal's name. And this is the political psychology you should not ignore. Rome didn't only fight Antiochus. Rome fought the possibility of another Hannibal story, another shock to Italy. That fear made moderation look like negligence. Somewhere in this phase, Hannibal becomes more than a rumor. He had reached Antiochus's court and, in the wider war, was used as a commander, particularly in naval operations. He was not running the entire strategy of the Seleucid state. Antiochus was not a puppet. But Rome didn't need Hannibal to be in charge to treat him as proof of hostile intent. In the Roman imagination, a named enemy functions like a disease. The mere presence is contamination. The war's tempo quickened. Control of seas, islands, and coastal cities mattered because armies don't travel through water by bravery. They travel by ships, harbors, and grain. Every siege and skirmish was also an audit. Who could keep paying for this? Who could keep feeding it? Antiochus had resources, yes, but the Seleucid state's strength was also its weakness. Big empires have more land to defend, more elites to placate, more corners where loyalty can fray if the king looks beatable. And then came the decisive collision, the Battle of Magnesia. Magnesia is where the two models of power met in their most honest form. On one side, Antiochus's world, royal prestige, heavy cavalry, war elephants, and the grand Hellenistic style, spectacle as intimidation, variety as strength. On the other side, Rome's world, legions that behave like a machine, allied contingents integrated into a single operational purpose, and commanders whose careers depend on decisive outcomes. The Roman command included Lucius Cornelius Scipio, later called Asiaticus, with the presence and prestige of his brother, Scipio Africanus, hovering over the campaign like a brand name. Rome understood image as well as any king. It understood that authority travels faster when you attach it to a famous family. Antiochus, for his part, assembled a massive force. Ancient sources and later estimates differ on exact numbers, but the point is uncontested. He brought the full weight of an Eastern superpower, including elephants meant to break lines and cavalry meant to shatter morale. It was not a raid, it was a statement. Seleucid kingship could still organize overwhelming violence on demand. Here is the confrontation at its most brutal. Violence as a debate. Each side is arguing a philosophy with steel. Rome's philosophy is that law can define reality. If Rome can defeat Antiochus decisively, Rome can treat him not as a peer, but as a subject of settlement, like Philip had been. That turns peace into administration. Antiochus's philosophy is that kingship cannot survive humiliation. Therefore, a king must win enough to preserve the appearance of equality. Even a draw would have been useful. But Rome does not seek draws. Draws are invitations. In the clash itself, the Hellenistic toolkit reveals its fragility. Elephants can terrify, but they can also panic. Cavalry charges can overwhelm, but they can also overextend. The more complex an army is, the more failure points it contains. Rome's legionary system was not invincible, but it was resilient. It could absorb shocks and keep functioning. And when the Seleucid line began to break, the battlefield turned into an accounting table. All that imperial grandeur, elephants, armor, banners, became assets suddenly depreciating at the speed of panic. This is the moral horror of decisive defeat. An empire doesn't just lose men, it loses credit. Allies reconsider, cities calculate, satraps ask whether the king is still worth obeying. A defeat at this scale creates political dehydration. Loyalty evaporates. Magnesia did exactly that. Antiochus was beaten, not just tactically, but psychologically. The liberator, who had tried to stand on Greek myth, was now a king forced back into his own territory, facing the ancient imperial terror, that a loss on the frontier becomes rebellion in the interior. And now Rome had what it always wanted, not only victory, but the right to right the settlement. Because here's the logic Rome was building all along. If we can defeat you, we can define you. And if we can define you, we can charge you. Tribute, hostages, disarmament, these aren't punishments in Rome's self-story. They're terms, the language of law. The transformation is complete. Violence becomes a contract, and contract becomes a cage. Plot turn. After Magnesia, the war is effectively decided. But the real question becomes what Rome will demand in peace, and whether Antiochus can survive the invoice without his empire coming apart. After Magnesia, Antiochus III still had a crown, but he no longer had what a crown truly rests on: the public belief that he could refuse. This is the moment where Rome's power becomes most revealing, not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. Because war is expensive. War consumes men, grain, ships, attention. And after you win, you face a choice: end the bleeding, or convert the victory into a system that prevents future bleeding. Rome chose the system. Rome always chooses the system. The Treaty of Apamea, concluded in 188 BC, was not a peace. It was an invoice. It was the Republic's philosophy of power written as clauses. Antiochus was forced to surrender territory in Asia Minor, lands that had been the connective tissue of Seleucid influence, handed off to Rome's allies and clients. This is how indirect empire works. Rome rarely needs to hold everything. It needs to decide who holds what. Every transfer of land creates a beneficiary, and every beneficiary becomes dependent on Rome for the legitimacy of that possession. Rome's allies grow stronger, but only inside a framework that Rome owns. Freedom becomes a franchise. He was forced to pay an enormous indemnity, 15,000 talents spread over years. You can dress it up as reparations, but economically, it's strategic strangulation. A giant payment drains a treasury. A drained treasury weakens garrisons. Weakened garrisons invite revolt. Revolt forces internal concessions. Internal concessions reduce royal authority. Royal authority collapses without even another Roman soldier crossing a border. This is empire by finance. The blade turned into a balance sheet. He was forced to hand over war elephants and accept restrictions on his navy. Again, it looks like disarmament. It's actually future-proofing. Elephants and ships are not just weapons, they are symbols. They allow a king to project force quickly, to intimidate cities into obedience, to move armies across distance, to make allies feel safe. Take those away, and you don't only reduce military options, you reduce political credibility. A king who can't arrive is a king who can be ignored. And then there were the hostages. A king who gives hostages is a king who has admitted, in public, that his word is not enough. That admission has an echo. It tells every subject and rival, the Seleucid king is now a managed entity. The Republic does not need to rule Antiochus's palace to control Antiochus's choices. It can hold his future in someone else's hands. Now we can finally answer the governing question we opened with. How did Rome turn liberation into a technology of control? So clean it looked like law, so moral it sounded like mercy, and so total it rewired the will of entire cities. Rome did it by converting violence into legitimacy and legitimacy into administration. First, it framed intervention as moral rescue. In Greece, Rome proclaimed freedom. That proclamation was not merely propaganda, it was a legal claim to oversee outcomes. Once Rome declared itself the guarantor of freedom, every Greek dispute could be recast as a threat to liberty, requiring Roman arbitration. Arbitration became supervision. Supervision became dependency. Second, Rome exploited the psychology of small states. The Greek world was not a unified victim. It was a marketplace of rivalries. City-states invited Rome against neighbors, begged for protection, denounced each other, filed complaints. Rome did not need to invent Greek division. It only needed to monetize it. Every appeal to Rome made Rome more necessary. Every Roman help came with conditions, and conditions, repeated long enough, become habit. Third, Rome used law as a ledger. The Senate asked, who is friend? Who is enemy? Who is free? Who is subject? These labels were not descriptive. They were coercive. Once labeled, a state's options narrowed. A friend must obey. A free city must accept Roman definitions of freedom. A rebel can be punished without moral cost. By the time Antiochus arrived in Greece, Rome had already created a legal ecosystem where his presence could only be read as aggression. That made war feel like defense, and defense is the cleanest form of violence. Finally, Rome turned victory into structure, the Treaty of Apamea. It didn't simply punish Antiochus. It reorganized the Eastern Mediterranean into a network where Rome's clients benefited, and therefore defended the Roman order. The settlement was not designed to end conflict. It was designed to ensure Rome would be the only power with the right to end conflict. So was the ultimate goal purification, or control of the people's will. Purification is the story Rome told itself. Control is the outcome Rome engineered. Because what changes after Apamea isn't only the map, it's the imagination. Greek states learn that sovereignty is negotiable, bought with alliance, lost with suspicion. Kings learn that prestige is no longer enough. Rome can downgrade you from peer to debtor with a vote. And Rome learns the most dangerous lesson a rising power can learn: that it can write law over other states and call it peace. This is why the Roman Seleucid War is not just a forgotten conflict, it is a blueprint. Greece, in the end, is not freed by anyone. It is managed by treaties, by garrisons, by the quiet fear that if you step out of line, Rome will return not as conqueror, but as protector. And the world will applaud as your autonomy is filed away like a document.